The purposes of the debaters will be keeping debate keeper. I'll just ring the bell now to show you what it sounds like. Alright, can everyone hear that?
You should time yourself.
Oh, you should just time yourself just in case. Okay, Prime Minister, here, you have the floor.
Speaker, we believe that notorious deceased leaders leave massive scars. The things that they have done to these communities, the things that they have done to these families, they've taken away human rights abuse, the silencing of dissenters. They've created mass killing and leaving post-trauma towards these communities. We feel like, for example, leaders like Fidel Castro, like Muammar Gaddafi, people like Bashar al-Assad, these people have created such horror towards these communities that it has left great massive scars towards them, right? We feel, therefore, these scars are often permanent. We think that these scars are permanent because it's embedded in this in the society through, for example, stories that are passed on in the families, or it's written down in their textbooks, right? Or it's mentioned or reminded during their Independence Day or their celebrations. Therefore, these stories and these horrific incidents are constantly reminded in the society. We feel that's why the debate today is we are going to prove to you that this proposal is the best to protect the family of the deceased leaders. Now, what do we propose, right? We propose for isolation of these family members. We will give them basic needs, making them comfortable, no thank you. Basically the same model that the Nigerian did to the state, and all of this will be provided by the state, right? And what do we actually mean by family members? We mean that family members which are of the immediate family and also including the cousins, basically people with the same surname, anything that could remind these communities of that particular notorious deceased leader. We feel that when are we, how long are we going to forbid these people? We feel that we are going to forbid them until integration happens. And when is integration going to happen? We feel that integration is going to happen until that democracy of that particular state is strong. When that state has independent democracy, or they have better enforced laws. States are, because the reason so is because these states which had these conflicts of these terrorists and these criminal organizations, most of these states are mostly nascent democracies, meaning that democracies are pretty much very weak. Therefore, when these democracies are pretty much very weak, we feel that the state cannot protect these people as much as they can protect in stronger democracies. Hence, we feel that it's only best for us to forbid these families that are related to these notorious leaders until integration can happen. So 3 things I'm going to talk about today. Number 1, I'm going to talk about how or why this form of protection is justified. Number 2, I'm going to talk about how the people of those communities would associate them to silent approval of these terrorist organizations or criminal organizations. And number 3, I'm going to talk about integration. No, thank you. First, we tell you that the memory of the deceased are still being embedded in the community. We feel that they are constantly reminded what happened to them. The murderings of their family, the killings of their friends. We feel that they were able to witness these horrific things that happened to them. This is not just stories we read off the magazine or we read off through our Twitter, right? These are things that happen in front of their own eyes, which remain constantly in their mind. This is what happens to them right now, is that we feel that once we put these family members out into the society or out into the open, this means that they'll have to live in interaction with other people. They'll feel that they finally have to engage in daily lives with the people of the community that their particular relative of that lead, because they're the relative of that leader, people will know them as, well, associate them to that particular leader, right? So basically, you're putting that particular family member in a position or in a very vulnerable position. Why are they such a vulnerable position? We feel that now that particular family member is a trigger to the people, right? Because you remind them of the tragedy of what happened. Why is being such a trigger, no thank you, such a bad thing? We feel that once you become a trigger of such a post-trauma conflict or post-trauma situation, we feel that these people of that community will start to engage in aggressive manner. For example, they would provoke you, or deny you some form of service, or don't want to engage with you. So we feel that these kind of things will create some form of microaggression, right? The worst thing is that if the sentiments of the leader are so strong, right, they would also accuse you of being associate to these notorious leaders and the criminal acts. And we feel this is very, very dangerous because it will go further to extreme measures. Yes, Robert.
So when democracy will exist, or the expect democracy will exist, we will never know. So would you also isolate generational descendants of this family that carry the same surname?
We say yes. If it carries the same surname, if this democracy is not strong enough, if the people are still reminded of these horrific things and they're still traumatized, we say yes until the democracy is strong. Second, I'm going to talk about how this would these people, these communities, will associate these families to silent approval. We understand that during the times where these notorious leaders were in power, the family members of these leaders were usually silent and did not respond to these killings, even if they weren't on the same page or they didn't agree with these criminal acts or terrorist acts. We feel that these families kept silent. Hence, these people of these communities would often associate them to giving some form of silent approval to conduct these acts. And we feel this is majorly dangerous because now these people will obviously associate these family members as people who are just like their leaders, who are just like the person that killed and tortured their family members before, and this hence will lead to greater aggression. Right? Thirdly, I'm going to talk about integration. Now, how do we feel that this would actually integrate the states? We feel that democracies with good integration policies can mitigate strong narratives, right? So therefore, we feel that what we should do first is isolate these family members who are related to these terrorist groups or terrorist organizations, and then we should educate the people first without triggering them by including these people or these family members into society. We feel that we should teach them things such as freedom of expression. We get to, at least once we educate them, we get to mitigate strong narratives that remind them of this trauma and remind them of this conflict that happened towards them. Once we get to educate these people and tell them that these families are not of no harm, then that's how we feel that integration can actually happen. We understand that maybe putting someone into that position or putting these people into the societies would maybe feel that they'll create some form of interaction and engagement, but we feel that it's very necessarily harmful because number one, those are weak democracies and we feel that we cannot protect them, and number two, we also feel that these people are not yet educated of freedom of expression. These people are not properly understanding of the situation and hence will lead to further progression. For all those reasons, Mr. Speaker, please side with them. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the panel for the speech
Mr. Speaker, we think that if your end goal is reintegration of these families of terrorists or criminal organizations, right, we think that the end goal cannot come when you isolate them for years on end, for generations on end, to the point that they will never ever deal with open society until like their great-great-great-grandchildren, and then you have a stable democracy. We think that that doesn't happen, right? Because what's more likely to happen is that this isolation will further entrench the idea that we did nothing wrong. So why are you punishing us? We think that given the fact that you're already giving them some form of regulation by controlling the amount of money they get, by giving them a stable income or whatever, right? We think that this form of regulation is already something that happens, right? You don't need to isolate them further. So this is what Side O is standing on. We're telling you that isolation cannot lead to reintegration, and isolation and demonizing these families will further entrench these these indoctrinated values that may or may not happen to be terrorist or extremist in nature, right? So what are we going to do today? We're going to first tell you how we're going to characterize to you these terrorist or criminal organization families. We're going to tell you how isolation necessarily exacerbates these indoctrinations that may have happened to them, how reintegration is the best form of controlling and regulation, and how society has an incentive to reintegrate these families at the end of the day, right? So let's talk first. Let's deal with some of the things they want to talk about, right? First, they wanted to tell us that democracy is the best form of reintegration. We tell you that's not true. We give you the example of the Philippines, right, where democracy is something that happens. Yet you still have a lot of people pushing against the Marcos's family, right, because they have done things in the past that they have not apologized for. We tell you that this form of apology cannot happen when you isolate them. The reason why the Imelda Marcos has never apologized to this day is because they were isolated from society and they were given the chance to say that, look, it wasn't our fault. You never let them live in society where people could tell them, look, your family did something wrong to begin with, right? You let them live in Hawaii for so long and now they come back and they say, oh, we still don't have to apologize for anything. That's the kind of ideology that happens under your side, right? Sit down. We think that on the other ideas of how it puts them in a vulnerable position and it triggers people, I will be dealing with that in my substantive, right? So, first of all, let's characterize terrorist families, and this deals with the idea that you have silent approval from the families to begin with. I think that these families live necessarily secluded lives, right? They necessarily or have not been dealing with society to begin with, right? We think that maybe some of them are upper crust, or even in terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, where these families are always on the run or always trying to be isolated from society so they will get caught, right? We think that this kind of upbringing typically exposes you to years of learning or at least some form of exposure to some form of extremism, right? We think that this is necessarily something that means, right? That means that there is this spectrum, right, of how these families exist, right? Some of them will necessarily totally agree with your extremist views, and some necessarily have their own views, or are at least trapped in the box that they have never seen outside of, right? We think that when you isolate them, you are giving them a reason to go further into this box, or at least maybe think that, oh, maybe the thing that I heard from my father might be correct, right? We think that this kind of isolation is what happens, right? When you to all sides of the spectrum, right? And this kind of isolation is something that we see like parallel to like North Korea, right? Because they've been isolated for so long, they have this indoctrination, and there are some North Koreans who do not have this indoctrination, but because they have been isolated, they are forced to subscribe to this indoctrination at the end of the day, right? So what does this further isolation necessarily do to these families? First of all, you demonize the family, and because there exists a spectrum, we say that it harms them, right? Because you're saying that you are different. You cannot live outside your bubble. We cannot put you into society, right? We tell you it also impacts greater society, because greater society, an open society, now says that, oh, we should never give them a second chance. We should never allow people to, reintegrate. And this kind of mentality leads to the harms that they want to talk about, right? Of the tension and whatnot, right? We tell you that this allows them to hold a grudge against these criminal families, and it also allows the criminal families to hold a grudge against greater society, because they're saying that, why aren't you letting us live outside of a bubble when we've been living inside this bubble for the whole entirety of our lives, right? So even if they don't, we think it's unfair, because you do have before that, yes.
So by putting these family members into the society immediately, do you think you can ensure their safety?
We tell you that safety is something that happens on our side. Let me tell you why, right? This deals with your POI and deals with your idea of tension, right? First of all, we think that it's a second chance that they do deserve to get, right? Because reintegration only happens when you allow people to live in society. That's why we think that the criminal justice system, where you have jail, is necessarily flawed, because reintegration is much harder when you isolate criminals and you isolate these people, right? It's an example. Secondly, we think that regulation exists. People cannot commit crimes willy-nilly just because they think that someone is different to them. That's the kind of protection that happens when you allow them to live in open society, right? Because you then allow them to regulate how they are treated, right? First of all, regulation happens because by forcing them to live in open society, you allow them to have any form of interaction with the outside world. even if it's just going outside to buy bread or whatever, they are still exposed to the outside world, and they are still allowed to see that, look, there's something different than what you have been growing up with. Right?
Yeah.
Secondly, we think that this, in cases where there is some tension, where there is a threat maybe of them being harmed, right? We think that this form of regulation is necessarily something that is good, right? Because it allows these criminal families to internalize the idea that, look, my upbringing had something wrong with it. My ideals that I was exposed to, there is something wrong, to the point that society thinks that maybe I shouldn't live with them. So this kind of internalization of the idea is how you manage to change them, right? Because not only are they not isolated to the point where they will not interact, but they're also interacting with other people with more liberal values, right? That says like you shouldn't be bombing people, or you shouldn't be, initiating martial law on your citizens and whatnot, right? We think that this kind of interaction, this kind of regulation, right, necessarily can only happen when you do not isolate them. Because if you were to isolate them, right, we think it's far easier for them to become radicalized. And we think that society can also recognize that, because society knows that, look, they are brought up a bit weird, so we shouldn't be treating them differently. We should be trying to make them feel better and trying to make them integrate to us, and that's the incentive that can only happen under opposition side. So this is why we should reintegrate.
I'd like to thank the leader of the shoulder speech. Now I invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Speaker, the whole case from opening opposition is basically place these families in a society which is scarred, which is traumatized. Let these societies shove it up their faces and tell them that your father or your family member was wrong. This was the whole opposition case. We would argue to you that this form of integration makes them even more radicalized, Speaker. Because at the end of the day, you are constantly reminding them of the atrocities that their father did, and the father in which side opening opposition said might be correct. I'm going to deal with a few things with arguments and rebuttals integrated. I'm going to talk about three things. Number one, I'm going to look at these families and how vulnerable are them to society. Number two, I'm going to look at the society and how opposition's case merely entrenches further the narrative that the strong sentiments against these notorious leaders. And thirdly, I'm going to look at integration. And at the end of the day, why a strong democracy in comparison to a nascent democracy is important when it comes to integration. So firstly, let's just understand these families. We do agree that in the upbringing of them is that they're secluded. But we would argue to you, like they say that, oh, they need to be constantly reminded of liberalism, or they need to be constantly reminded that society, their fathers were wrong. We think that this argument assumes as if in isolation we can't constantly remind them. We would say that in isolation, it will also mean that they will realize that the state is protecting them against a society which is already against them. Because they know from the very beginning that the society is already against them. Therefore, this form of protection would mean that it is entrenched within them that states is protecting them in its sense. But secondly, right, we will also argue to you that side opposition merely strengthens these ideologies that they're afraid will relapse into the heads of these families. Why do you say so? Because when you integrate them in a society which is aggressively going against them, that aggressively attacks them, denies them from service, it constantly reminds them that they're living in a society which is us against them, Speaker. That is the point in which you could say, maybe this is the reason why my father wants to kill them, Speaker. This is the constant reminder in which side opposition actually wants to push for. We think it makes it even worse. In comparison, we would say, Speaker, integration might take years. It would take years for these sentiments to be diluted. But we would say that this form of isolation would mean that you're protecting them from this part of society, Speaker. At the end of the day, it's comparatively better. Yes.
If they were so aggressively attacked to the point where they feel so insecure with themselves, why would they leave on their own?
Speaker, look, living on their own doesn't necessarily mean that states won't do the necessary precautions to ensure safety as well. We will also say, to the extent we'll put gut houses in them, we'll put them in an isolated situation where even people do not know where they are. So all of that doesn't necessarily matter. Secondly, right, let's just look at these societies. Do they really have the incentive to integrate? Argument from opposition. They say, well, states, the society has an incentive to integrate because they feel like they've been wrong and they want to be compensated, Speaker. We think compensation isn't the responsibility of the families to give. That's number one. Number two, the apologies from the families are also not the responsibility to give. Therefore, all of their arguments about the families, like openly, the example from Philippines, like the families openly saying they're sorry, we don't necessarily think that that's their responsibility. You're putting a burden onto a stakeholder that isn't directly involved or isn't directly responsible for the atrocities of their father. We think that morally in itself is wrong. But number two, let's just look at society and what do they want with these families, right? We would also say that these societies also want a form of reparation in terms of how they view the terrorists or how they view the families. This means that the society wants to see they want to see the real truth. This is when the argument coming from my PM was important. Why a strong democracy, or at least a democracy, for example, with strong authority, with a strong authority, with an independent judiciary that they can implement laws which are strong. The comparative is here, Speaker, right? In these democracies, expression and education is progressive. It would mean that both of this combined would mitigate sentiments which are strong, sentiments against terrorists. Why do we say so? Let's just look at Malaysia, right? Post-colonial, like during that time, we had extremely strong sentiments against the British, or we had strong sentiments against integration of like non-Burmese at that time. But how democracy has progressed and become progressive to the point in which there are like mitigating factors to that. It means that people could say, look, they are wrong, or look, the Brits have actually made some benefits. We've progressed in railways, or we've actually gotten some technology, or you can understand that the immigration policies during that time was not the fault of the Chinese or the Indians. Those are the types of things which happen when a democracy at least have a progressive form of expression, or a progressive form of, a progressive democracy. These are states which are in a nascent state, in a nascent condition. It means that they are weak. Laws aren't fully implemented. Laws aren't necessarily strong. This is when we will argue to you as well that in the terms of integration, putting them down, you need to make sure that the sentiments are weak, or that there are ways to mitigate that sentiment. But even in our worst case scenario, right? Even in our worst, that democracy is strong. These sentiments are still strong. Society is still going against them. We would argue to you at this point in time, laws are stronger, enforcements are stronger, and that accountability is higher in this position. At the end of the day, what's really important is to protect a family which is not responsible for the atrocities which are done by their previous ancestors. This debate is about who best protects a vulnerable family in a very aggressive and highly sentimental society. Thank you. Thank you.
Speaker, we think the problem with OG, right, is that the soft stand they decided to take, which is basically, look, they're going to wait until like the strong democracy that they want, which had no analysis on how long it's going to take, and then only they're going to allow people to reintegrate, right? We think that this stance itself doesn't really make sense, because if you really wanted change to happen, then take the stance now, make it happen now. We don't see the necessary need for you to wait until a certain period of time, until like whatever democracy, the strong democracy you want is going to happen, right? Because number one, we don't see the exact nuances or the exact analysis. When is this democracy going to happen, right? We don't think that it's okay for you to shackle generations upon generations of like shackle people to the idea of terrorism and all that, just for waiting them, just to make them wait for the idea of them being like no longer terrorists, right? We don't think it's justified under your paradigm. You're just going to drown out, you're just going to like draw out the problem, and you're never going to solve it, right? What did Ashley say, right? Because they fail to engage on the idea that interaction is important. Because number one, look, interaction can go two ways, right? Either one, they shun them, or number two, some people are like on the fence, are willing to forgive them, right? If that's the case, right, it goes good either way. Number one, if they are able to create assets and allies under the circumstances, if there are people who are willing to forgive them and understand them, those are the kinds of benefits they are willing to take, who can protect them from people who shun them, right? Even if you want to make the argument that there are some people who are going to go against them and are going to shun them, right? We think this itself is a necessary like harm, which can at the end of the day allow people to actually understand what they're going through, right? Because look, these people, unless you're going to go and just say that, look, you're evil or whatever, right? We think that the form of interaction and discourse and like whatever communication you have eventually leads for you to have a normal understanding, right? How does this happen? You see these people walking on the streets every day. You see these people like doing whatever they want, like a normal person on a daily basis, right? This is the only way for you to normalize this behavior, and this is the only way for you to actually solve and like not entice them to the whole idea of terrorism, right? Sit down. And they also talk about how they want to change narrative, right? Look, the only way for you to change any analysis of people is for you not to alienate them and let them like stay in their own analogy forever. And this is also not engaged by their side, because we tell you the moment you put a barrier between these two parties, that's when you don't allow any form of breach upon these people. You don't allow any form of common ground for them to meet. We tell you the moment you isolate these people, you don't allow them to have any form of information, any form of discourse or communication to enter and tell them that the ideology is different, right? The moment you isolate them, you create a barrier between them. Like, we think that's when you allow them to be further entrenched and indoctrinated in their own ideology, and that's when they can make their own conclusion, right? We believe that the narrative that these people are enticed to terrorists will be even worse, because society will never be able to see the limelight. Society will never ever be able to see how people can change. And this is the exact harm that's going to happen and further perpetuate under their case. Because like in comparison, right, we think at least under our case, the fiction that they will get leads to some form of benefit, right? We think that at least under our case, the people will then regularize and normalize the whole idea of them being under these kinds of lives and whatnot. We think that at the end of the day, even if the form benefits, we still think that those allies that they can create and people who are understanding and willing enough to stand for them are the kinds of benefits that we are willing to take. Before I move to my argument, yeah, sure.
How your discussions happens when it's blocked by sentiment that says that these are families which silently approve the atrocities of the terrorists?
Look, these people, like more often than not, we need to understand, these people who are associated with terrorists, more often than not, they have no or like little say to what their family leaders did, right? If that's the case, they can obviously like justify to an extent, like they can make them understand, like if they're really like what are the views, or maybe like, they really didn't want this kind of action to be taken. We see that the only way for this to happen is for you to have that form of discourse. And even if it leads to sentimental issues, we think that you still have to tackle the issue now rather than you like drowning it out for so long and just letting people jumping to their own conclusions, right? We think that at the end of the day is for you to have a society that progress, right? Is for you to have like these kinds of people who are willing to like exchange their energies and like reach the common ground. On my argument, right? We think at the end of the day, it's unjustified for you to shackle these people to these ideas of being a terrorist, right? Because this is exactly what's going to happen under their paradigm. Because we think that the time period is very sensitive. What do I mean by this, right? Because considering this is a political stable, right? We think at the end of the day, by the time you actually achieve a stable democratic like whatever you want to have under your paradigm, that the time period is going to be so long that you shackle these people and and all the generations that's going to come to the family members, right? You never allow these people or the future generations to be able to move on and be able to do whatever they want. when you forever have this democracy and you forever force these ideologies or this narrative upon these children, right, we think it's extremely unjustified for you. Because like whatever these people, these leaders did, right, it's more often than not they have no say to say, right? We don't think it's justified for you to pass on the stigma or to pass on this narrative towards generation until you achieve that form of democracy, right? We think that is harmful on two reasons. Number one, you don't allow these children, like, because number one, these people have been secluded, right? They have been like stripped off of many rights, the ability to reintegrate society, the ability to actually have a job or whatever, right? The ability to actually like, do whatever they want in society, right? Like these are all the kinds of circumstances and rights that they have been taken away. We think that these kinds of ability for them to actually have any form of dependency on their own is going to be largely ripped off simply because you don't allow society to actually change the narrative, right? And this is the exact harm that's going to further perpetuate if you have no form of interaction, if you have no form of ability, right? We think it's not justified for you to be punished or whatever simply because something that your ancestors did, right? And this is exactly what's going to transpire under government's case. We think at the end of the day, it's high time we be able to move on. It's high time we don't shackle them into a narrative that they had no say or a little say, right? We think at the end of the day, the only way for you to have this problem solved is for you to do it now. We think that the allies that you're going to create or the enemies you're going to create will eventually lead to important interactions that will actually make you understand what this is going to do, right? Even if their views are different or radical or whatever, the only way to breach and sink in those ideas is for you to have those hard discussions. And if that's the case, you are more than proud to protect that. At the end of the day, what OO said, right? We said that it's very important for people to have a common ground or for them to interact. We tell you that it's not okay for you to entrench these people through generations until you achieve your whatever democracy you want to have. We think at the end of the day, the only way for you to solve the problem is to solve it now rather than let it draw out for so long. For all these reasons, go with OO. Thank you.
That concludes the opening of this debate. Begin the closing up. I would like to invite member of government to sit
Mr. Speaker, here is a question that I want all of you to take into consideration. Just imagine I was the brother of the leader of Taliban. I haven't done anything yet. I haven't done anything at all. I'm a peaceful person. If I paid a visit to the Swat Valley where my gang shot Malala in the head, do you think they would engage in discourse with me, debate with me, want to know exactly why I did that? Or would they take a cricket bat and smash my head into bricks? Now this is a very, I mean, look, it's a little bit exaggerated, but you have to understand that status quo is already treating these people like shit. And we cannot, and look, this thing is very logical to assume, considering it happens under two circumstances. One, if these people happen to live nearby, there's already that logical harm. They will face all sorts of discrimination. They will face hostility in all forms. And even if these people do not happen to live in a place nearby, they're always still put on watch lists. They're always still monitored everywhere they go. They talked about opportunities. Ladies and gentlemen, here's my rebuttal to that. They don't have opportunities. If you share common names with terrorist organizations or terrorist groups or terrorist leaders, forget even being their relative. If you have that name, you can be denied entry to certain countries, which is why Kamal bin Laden was not allowed in the United States, which is why a debater in IIUM was not allowed entry into the United States. He is not a terrorist, but sharing the name already doesn't allow you to go there, let alone actually being part of that family. So you're already put in a watch list. Nobody wants to go to university with Osama's brother. That is already, the status quo is already giving them quite a hard time. So that being said, there aren't necessarily lots of opportunities left. So now the state's duty is to look for the best way to cater to the rest of the life, to the rest of the years that these people have to live. And letting them live in the society that is already hostile to them, already demonizes them for something their relatives have done, is not the best way to go. They talked about how we need to make change right now, how change has to happen right now. Ladies and gentlemen, look, we are doing this right now. This is a form of change. And this is a form of change that is far more realistic than the one they're trying to go for. Because look, no matter how much they said that this is the best way for them to communicate with them, engage in discourse, we need to understand that these people are no longer in the proper sense. These people aren't going to look at these family members and approach it from a logical or reasonable point of view. The people who are there in Swat Valley, or the people in rural Afghanistan that are being killed, or the people in Nigeria, the women there that are being mistreated by Boko Haram, they're already in an extremely emotional point. The people there are not the people in this room. The people there have been destroyed, have been raped, have been deprived of basic necessities, and will not ever think about trusting someone of the same heritage. And it is extremely dangerous that we let this happen. This is a form of protection, not a form of punishment, which is why their comparison to prison was extremely invalid. We're not punishing these people because we too recognize they are not to blame, but we know that society will blame them. That's why we're not putting them with these people. These people aren't in the state of mind that will be willing to engage with these people on a proper level. So ladies and gentlemen, what am I going to tell you today? How this is the best form of protection that a state can provide to these people. But there'll be an extension from our side in this argument. So ladies and gentlemen, look, the first level of analysis that I want to give to this is that these terrorist organizations have influence. Before that, make it clear.
If society is really as vengeful as you say, how long can you necessarily protect them until society decides that, look, we've done enough for these families, we should just kill them now?
Look, if the message still exists, if the rhetoric still exists, if the danger still exists in society, then we have to protect them. Then we have to segregate them as long as it happens. It's a pretty logical thing to assume. And more of that later in my speech. But now we're talking about why this is the best form of protection. So like I said, ladies and gentlemen, the first thing the first level analysis that I'm going to give is that these terrorist groups have influence and their message stays back. Even if the leader is dead in this case, even the leader has been deceased. If we're talking about the organization like the Taliban, last week we just found out that their leader actually had been dead, the one giving the tweets. It was another guy that had already replaced him. When Osama bin Laden died, the Al-Qaeda was not gone. Why am I explaining this? The relevance of this is that the message still stays on. So as long as the message stays on, as long as the organization still exists, the hatred will still exist, and the attacks being carried out on these people will still exist. So whether the person is still alive or not is completely irrelevant, considering these people still have someone to blame. And okay, so now there's two things that I'm going to talk about to this argument. Now there's one, the first level analysis is that why this segregation is extremely dangerous. And now see, ladies and gentlemen, the point I'm trying to make here is that these people are currently vulnerable. And this was touched on a little bit on their side, but here's an extension. Look, apart from the radicalization, which could happen, like when you segregate them, ISIS actually calls these people gray zones. Like, for example, in the United States, Muslims who are being segregated, these are people that are vulnerable. And in this case, these people are the most vulnerable because they're being segregated to the point in which they're demonized, they're criminalized just for being a relative. That's why we want to separate them. So being vulnerable, these terrorist organizations have a person they want to recruit. The people they prey on are people who are vulnerable. And this is some of the easiest people to prey on, considering they're relatives of your former leader. You know where they live. You know where they reside currently. If a state protects them and keeps them separated, it is also not only for their benefit, but for the collective good of society to prevent radicalization of these individuals, which could lead to more attacks. But in the instances in which these people do not agree with the attacks that these terrorists are giving out, or these people completely disagree and will not persist and will not be radicalized, there is still a tangible harm present, considering, like I said earlier, these people will still have the incentive to want to attack them, to want to discriminate against them because they had been a relative. So being of that family line, we understand that you are not to blame here, and we made it very clear from our side that this is not a form of punishment, this is a form of protection, and it is a form of protection that is far more realistic than the ones that they're trying to push forward. If we allow these people to stay in these societies, if we allow these people to integrate and just hope that one day rural Pakistan or rural Afghanistan will want to engage in debates and conversations with the guy whose brother killed their parents, then look, I ask you this. You have to make a comparison, and I want the next speaker to come up here and tell me how it's more logically possible, or how it's more logically consistent that when you keep them segregated and away from all these harms, these people are more likely to live as opposed to where they live now. Because it is no longer a debate of whether or not, it's a debate of whether their lives can be in danger. And a state's big duty towards its people is to protect their lives, especially in this instance. And when you're putting them there in hopes that people would change and accept them, you're putting them in far more danger as opposed to separating them as a whole. For all those reasons, ladies and gentlemen, go to our side.
I'd like to thank the member of government and now inviting the new opposition.
So I don't know when democracy gets better. In a world where there's corrupted structures enforcing the fact that they continuously get elected and there's no space for democracy to exist, I don't know how the democracy improves or the democracy is allowed to exist in a better way. So all I can assume from side opening government is that this is going to be for a very, very long time. And you can see that generationally, they want to isolate these individuals. Now, just because integration happens doesn't mean democracy will exist. Just because democracy happens doesn't mean integration exists. They exist separately, right? Individuals have to come to accommodate each other. The democratic structures have to exist. They have to be less corrupt. Some kind of intervention needs to exist. So I don't understand why they associate those two things and realize that those two things will solve each other. I'm going to talk about one, how you screw over minorities. Two, I'm just going to quickly extend further on the idea of principal fairness. And I'm going to add nuance to the argument of antagonization because I thought it wasn't well explained, even though the intention was quick. A couple of responses. Number one, they told us in closing opposition that the message will still exist. Now, here's where we need to draw an important delineation. If these family members are still pursuing the causes of their husbands or their terrorist leaders and organizations, they will go to jail. This is not about them. This is about the people who are apathetic, don't do anything, are constantly just being normal, living their own lives. If they hold the message in their head, you solidify that message by telling them that you have to stay away from society, don't be exposed to counter narratives, you keep that message going and no way of countering that message. I'll explain the argument further a bit later. Now let's talk about protecting the family, right? Because this is essentially the stance of government in this debate. We want to protect the family because they go through all these harms. This is why I pointed out, this debate is not about the people who would have wanted to leave anyways. Right? This debate is about people who have wanted to stay, but you would forbid them from staying. This means that they access the most amount of closure from all the shit life that they've lived with their terrorist husbands if they stayed in open society. You will tell them that you have to leave and live in isolations. So I do not understand how you protect the family when people should be able to adjudicate the amount of harm that they face themselves and not the state. Right? So we don't think that they are somewhat protecting the family. We don't think that this intervention helps them achieve their closure because their closure is determined for themselves. That's why I argued in a POI that if essentially they were truly triggered by all this aggressive behavior by society, they would leave regardless. I will show you why integration happens better on my side. But before that, yeah.
What form of closure are you talking about when they're constantly reminded that they're the family members of a terrorist?
So obviously you can weigh things out, right? I prefer still going to the grocery shop and seeing some people, even though those some people may antagonize me, as opposed to not seeing anyone in an isolated exile world that Napoleon was in and sort of screwed him up even further. One, minorities. We would argue that oftentimes terrorist organizations are formed by minority groups. Why is this so? Right? Because oftentimes they come from somewhat oppressed minority groups that want to challenge the government and anti-establishment because the government hasn't been providing to them some cause like the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Or two, there is no political avenue for them to fight for their cause. That's why they turn to terrorism because they don't have the majority support in parliament to let them access all these benefits as a human being in that country, right? And secondly, if you're talking about criminal organizations, these are oftentimes also leaders in ethnic enclaves that are turned a blind eye by the state, like favelas in Brazil, shanty towns in Sri Lanka, stuff like that, right? We think that arguably these are individuals from minority groups that have large swaths of family members, associates, very close friends that carry their name, but are still geographically within the areas of open society, or at least still have access to open society. What you essentially do is that you create comparatively a larger gap between these ethnic minorities and the larger majority of society, right? Why is this bad? Because what you essentially do is you create the kind of concentration camps that we saw with the Japanese in the United States during World War II, where the United States thought that they were going to be spies for the Japanese, so they created like separate like areas for them to live. You create situations like for the Rohingyas in Myanmar, you create situations like the Jews in Nazi Germany, right? Essentially creating a gap between these two communities or ethnic minorities makes it worse for the idea of integration. Because the perceived idea would be, even if it's not true, even if there's some members of criminal organizations who are from the majority, the perceived idea would be that this is racial politics, right? That the government is prosecuting me because of my race, the government is separating me from other individuals. That's when you make them more pissed off, that's when you make it harder for individuals to empathize against each other. I'll extend this further by saying, this is when you enforce the idea to the majority that these people are dangerous, that these families are dangerous. Anyone carrying this surname is dangerous. Just like how you put a lion in a cage or a bear in a different area of the zoo, this is by telling them by association that these people will not interact well with you, and you tell them that they're dangerous, people will constantly be reminded by the idea. No, thank you. Let's extend further on the idea of antagonization, right? So you create all these shit environment for ethnic minorities, so on and so forth. Why is antagonization work? So OO told you that the set isolation itself is bad because it makes them somewhat angry. I'm going to extend it, I'm going to nuance it slightly more. So one, the reason why you create that antagonization is one, because you generate animosity towards the state, right? So generally these terrorist leaders, generally these criminal organizations work on a very empathetic stance towards anti-establishment and don't really support state policies and so on and so forth. What you essentially do is that by separating them, you justify that anti-establishment stance taken by those husbands of those families, or like fathers of those families, or wives of those families, right? So what it also means is that they're more likely to be empathetic to this anti-establishment stance because the state does not protect me and are making me do things against my will. Secondly, by association with other families, right? Because what does this policy do? The state doesn't have massive amounts of space to put families in like many different parts of the country and like spend resources in many different parts of the country to create comfortable living experiences everywhere. So they're likely to centralize that somewhere, right? What does this mean? This means you create families of criminal organizations with other families of criminal organizations, all who empathize with they are more likely to empathize with anti-establishment stances. When you allow these families to sympathetically resonate with each other and that stances exist with no counter narratives, that's when they're more likely to radicalize. And if they radicalize and usurp into offshoot terrorist movements, that's when people will say they will never change. And that's when true integration will never. You're out of time, bro. Next, on lastly, the idea of principal fairness, right? We would say that, very importantly, we shouldn't sacrifice the lives of innocent individuals who have not done anything. Because these are two groups of people. One who have done nothing to aid and abet these criminal organizations, otherwise they would have been in jail. Two, people who have actively opposed this, but will feel longer into staying, right? And have lived a very dangerous life of like drug trafficking, of violence. What you're essentially doing, panel, is that you're treating people who've already been treated like shit for their whole lives, and you make it worse for them. CEO's response to this was, yeah, they're already treated like shit. We would say, yeah, you make it worse. And that's not something we would stand for. We're very, very happy to oppose.
Speaker, two things they forgot to address in this thing. Firstly, is that they forgot to address how in status quo, discourse is already hard to be able to exist because there's already an existing narrative that these people are bad, these people are associated with terrorist leaders. And secondly, they forgot the fact that when government isolate them, it's not that the government are treating them badly. The government will ensure that these people are living in a safe and comfortable environment, and this is good for these people, because in status quo, because they already conceded to the fact that in status quo they don't have a good life. So what we're doing, what we're providing to them, we're giving them a comfortable life so they can settle down and they can find closure in it. So three issues that I'll be talking about in today's debate. Firstly, I'll be talking about the issue of how about tension and threat. Secondly, I'll be talking about the issue of discourse and instruction. Thirdly, I'll be talking about the issue of rights, stripping of rights. But before that, a few responses to closing opposition. So they told us that, okay, so in their world, if these families of the terrorist leaders happen to engage in violence, to try to create an uprising, they'll go to jail. But they also concede to the fact that these states are still politically unstable. How are you able to ensure that these people can be brought to jail, that that violence will not happen? Secondly, they wanted to talk about how it will create a larger gap, and that this will worsen integration. But Speaker, we tell you that we are willing to take the trade-off of having this gap, rather than letting these people either being harmed in the society or encouraging or internalizing their ideals to other people. Thirdly, they want to talk about how when you put all these families together in one place, you would be able to empathize with each other, and that they would be able to resonate with each other's ideals, and this would radicalize them even more. But I'll respond that in my issue. Before that, yes.
When you further entrenched into the minds of society that a family name is linked to terrorism, you further punish the descendants who had nothing to do with the terrorism to begin with.
Speaker, when we separate them, there's an existing rhetoric that we're saying these people are not wrong. These people, we just want to protect these people because when they're being put in society, it's going to be more dangerous upon them. So moving on to my issues. Firstly, on the issue of tension, so they already concede to the fact that now these families live a secluded life and they're always on the run. They concede to the fact that these families are already living a hard life and people are already discriminating and isolating themselves from these families. But what are they doing? They're placing these vulnerable individuals in open society, and they're exposing, which makes them exposed to harmful rhetorics that would not make them feel belong at all. They clearly ignore status quo as to how it's hard to engage in discourse, how it's hard to have sort of a peaceful engagement with the society. These families are already being demonized in society, and what you're doing is making these innocent individuals open to more harmful rhetoric. So, but what we're doing on the outside, we're providing a safe and comfortable environment for them to improve their quality of life, for them to settle down, and for them to find closure. We're literally improving their quality of life, because in comparison now, they live in seclusion, but at the same time, they would still have to try hard to integrate because they don't have anywhere to go. But in comparison to outside, we're improving their quality of life, even though isolated from society, but they're still safe, or we still ensure their safety. And then they wanted to talk about how, on the issue of radicalization, we believe that on our side, radicalization would not happen because they're conditioned to think that they're being separated from society because they've been associated with a terrorist leader, and this is wrong, right? So they're not empowered by ideals. They're not empowered by people who still might support the ideology of the terrorist group in society. And this makes them think that, oh, okay, so these ideologies are wrong, so I'm not supposed to support it anymore. So we don't think that radicalization would happen on our side. Secondly, on the issue of discourse and interaction, right? They wanted to talk about how normalization will happen, but we believe that normalization would take a long time. But in the meantime, these people would suffer, and the society in nature is not accepting of them. And they're not able to create allies, because the only allies they're able to create is those who still hold on to the same values as these terrorists. On your world, there's more possibility to be empowered by supporters of terrorism who pander on the vulnerability of these individuals. The only discourse you're able to get is a discourse that could possibly empower a deceased ideology, not empower reconciliation. Moving on to my third issue, right? An issue of how we're stripping off rights. In status quo, these families are being in constant surveillance. The government is always looking at them, and they're already living. They're already finding it hard to survive, and they're not open to much opportunities anyway, because these people, when they're being associated with terrorist groups, people don't want them to be in society. People don't want to make them feel belong because they're scared, or because there's an existing discrimination in the association. So we're willing to take the trade-off, because at the very least, on our, they can feel belong, they can find closure, they would not be haunted by the past anymore. But in your world, the harmful rhetorics upon them still exist, and this is and we don't want, and this would not happen in our world. And protection in your world will not happen, because these people, when they're open society, people would still harm them. So what I've told you in today's debate, I've told you how in our world it's better, because we're willing, even though they live in seclusion, we're willing to take the trade-off, because now we can ensure their safety, now we can ensure that they're protected. And with that, I'm proud to.
That concludes the first side. Now I'd like to invite the operator to conclude this debate. Here.
It is odd that the government's bench's solution to the shitty treatment the family members of these criminals get is to treat them in an even worse way. So what did PM come up and say, right? They want to isolate these people to protect them, right? Because we want to protect, because they want to protect them until integration happens, and that happens when there is a stronger democracy, right? Now, Kelvin has already told you in his extensions that has already told you that the link between democracy and integration is very, very weak, right? There's little to no correlation with that. Now, then after that, they came up to tell us about a lot of the outcomes they think will be achieved through this policy, right? Through having this kind of things. But we tell you that this kind of outcomes of protecting the family, having integration, right, is not exclusive on their side. Then it can be achieved under the status quo, under the org, right? And I'll tell you that later in the issues later, right? But the main difference is how we achieve these issues, right? Is that opposition gives them the choice and the freedom to make the decisions for themselves. So now, then CG comes up to tell us about how they want to give them the best form of protection, and they talk a little bit about radicalization, right? So yeah, sure, I'll take one from opening.
Look, your best case scenario is integration. How will you do that in a nascent democracy where freedom of expression is limited, protection of the law, independent authority?
Yeah, sure. Sure. So you want integration but yet you put them in isolation in the first place. So like how is that going to happen, right, when you isolate them? Because at the end of the day, you can't say, I want to make a right turn and then turn your steering wheel to the left. Because that just doesn't happen. That logically just doesn't happen, right? So I want to move on to my issues. So I have 3 issues, right? Three issues that are very relevant in this debate, right? Now, which side protects better the family? Secondly, which side tackles the negative sentiments and the narrative against the family? 3, we talk about, do the ends justify the means? So, number 1, in protection of family, I talked about this earlier on how this protection that we provide to the family members is not exclusive to the government bench, because we do not have to isolate them in little enclaves, in little ghettos, in small towns exclusively for this kind of people to be able to protect them. Because the fact that these criminal organizations, these terrorist organizations are defeated, right, it shows that law and order exists in the state in the first place, as opposed to what they said earlier. Because when you see that they can be defeated, it means that the law and order is still available in the country, is still working in the country, that they can still be protected under the law. They do not have to be separated in order for that to happen. So protection of family happens in the status quo, but we do not have to take away their freedom, to put them in isolation, like in a concentration camp or like in a prison. And then we talk about, then they talk about radicalization, right? We tell you that we better protect the family members from being radicalized, right? We tell you it's easier to be radicalized when you are in little enclaves of people who share the same past as you. Because when you actively engage in society, when you buy things, whether small kinds of interaction, right? Like you will be reminded that this is wrong. And you will be reminded that this is wrong, as opposed to just staying in little enclaves of people sharing the same ideology, where you can be more easily radicalized. And we tell you that that is more dangerous on your side. Sit down. Secondly, about sentiments and narratives against the family, right? So we want to ask the question of which side is more likely to antagonize the family. Now we tell you that it is the government bench, because they want to isolate them, right? They want to make them a faraway symbol of the past times, where it is easier to demonize them, where it is easier to say, hey, these guys are 50 miles away in a small town, living among a group of criminals who are not caught for some reason. However, we make them integrate in society, we make them engage with people, we make them interact with people. It is much easier to humanize them. It is much easier to have discourse, some form of conversation. We have some form of conversation we can have with them. So there's a skill here, right? As opposed to no discourse happening on their side because they are isolated, or some discourse happening on the CO side, because we think some form of discourse is much better than having none at all. And we think government whip actually traded it off earlier in her speech already. And we think that when you isolate them, you further entrench the idea that they are complicit in the crime, right? So, and moving on to the third issue, right? Do the ends justify the means? Now, in criminal justice, we know that it is wrong to punish someone for something that they didn't do, for something that someone else did. So, and the same way, we can see, even though they are direct family members, it is wrong to punish them, to take away the freedom from them. Because now OG said that first they said that they are complicit in their silent approval. Then they said they shouldn't be responsible. We agree, because there are two types of people, two types of family members. People who are complicit in their silent approval, who agree, who consented to these kind of activities, and people who don't, but are forced to stay, because if they leave, they'll be killed. Because if they leave, they will be banished, they will lose their support. Because we cannot be unfair to have such a blanket ban over people who consented to these crimes and people who did not. Because, as Calvin said earlier, they are either forced, some are forced or coerced into it and can't leave. And again, it is unjustified to have such a blanket ban on both consenting and non-consenting parties. So on the three issues, right, we tell you closing opposition better protects the family. We tell you closing opposition better manages the sentiments and the narrative against the family by having some form of discourse as opposed to having none at all. We tell you that even though the ends, we tell you that the outcomes are not exclusive to the government bench, and we say that you cannot integrate society when you build a wall on whatever common ground the two parties have. With that, I'm very proud to oppose.
Equality, cross-examination in the room. All of us are